Yeah, welcome to another session of our section Questions of Doubt in Corporate Valuation. My name is Bernhard Schwetzler, and our today's question of doubt is: what are the costs of unfunded pension obligations? It's a particular German question, a particular German problem. Yeah? Because as you may know, in Germany, firms are allowed to take pensions and pension reserves as an obligation on their own balance sheet. Yeah? So you see here, that's an internal obligation that they have. That means that the firm itself is liable for the pension. So you see that some firms still stick to this internal solution. For instance, here ThyssenKrupp in the annual report of 2017 shows around 8 billion euro as a pension obligation to its pensioners or to its employee. And our today's question of interest is: what are the costs of this funding source, and is it cheaper or is it more expensive than a standard debt contract that the firm could have from its bank, for instance? Yeah. And through the back door, of course, this affects corporate valuation as a topic as well, because if it is cheaper, then of course the value of ThyssenKrupp should be higher, relying on a cheap funding source than compared to its peers without having access to this funding source. And it's more expensive, then of course the value of ThyssenKrupp should be lower than the one of its peers. Yeah. So, and if you look into the literature, then you find quite significantly different answers to this question on these costs. Yeah. Some sources are that it's very expensive, that the costs are even above 10% per year, whereas others simply point out that it's equal to the interest that is shown in the profits and loss statement of the firm that has this pension obligation on its own balance sheet. Yeah? We will tackle this right now. So, the first idea is that we look at this pension reserve as a credit that the employee or the pensioner has given to his own firm. Yeah? So the idea is that the service cost, that is the annual contribution that is made to this pension reserve, substitutes wage, that is this amount is paid out as cash. And then the employee says, well, I don't need that money right now. I give it back to you as a credit, and you keep this until I have retired, and then you pay down this amount as my credit that I've given you. And the same applies, of course, for the interest cost. The interest in the P&L of the firm on these pension reserves is not directly paid out, or it is paid out for 1 second, and then the employee brings it back and says, well, I give this as an additional credit on top on my substituted wage. Yeah? So, and then after retirement, the accumulated amount on my credit account from my employee is then paid down and redeemed, and this is then the pension. Yeah? And of course, I mean, there is some uncertainty about the expected lifetime, but for the time, we assume that the lifetime of the employee is given with certainty, just to look at our problem. Yeah. So under this picture, or under this assumption, it is a credit that comes fully out of the pocket, 100% out of the pockets of our employee. Yeah. So, and you see here that as the annual contributions have to be made every year for every year in service that the employee is working for our firm, then of course our total pension reserve for one employee may be seen as a portfolio of credits. Yeah? So here in the first year, perhaps with 30 years, we make the promise to pay the pension, and then we have 35 years of service if the employee stays with our firm so long, and then after retirement, the lifetime is another 25 years. So the first contribution is a credit here that accumulates over 35 years service period, and then translates into a 25 years annuity or 24 year string of annuity. And of course, the next year is then only 34 years service, 33 years service. And you see then out of this accumulated contributions, then the pension is paid as an annuity. Yeah? And that means that here, as our service cost is declining year by year. Of course, here each of these strings has a different time to maturity in this portfolio. So if we take interest into account, then the idea roughly stays the same, but due to the power of interest, of course, the firm does not have directly to contribute that much money as service cost, as here in this example, without any interest. Yeah, but the idea still stays the same. So now answering the question, what are the true costs of this funding source? And the answer to this question crucially depends on this wage substitution rate, or the percentage that the service costs, in that sense, substitute cash wage. Yeah? Let's start here with a wage substitution equal to 100%. Yeah? And that means that the credit that the employee is giving us here stems to 100% out of the pocket of the employee. Yeah? So the service cost in that sense is fictitiously paid out as cash to the employee, and then the cash pays it 100%, then the employee pays it back to our corporation as a credit. Yeah? And as this wage substitution is 100%, the cost of the credit is equal to the interest that is shown in the firm's P&L. Yeah? So in that sense, it seems to be the case that pension reserves are rather cheap, or they are as cheap or as expensive, at least if you look at the interest rate, as a regular straight debt of the firm. Yeah? Well, on the other hand, one has to say that it is not very realistic that our service cost is fully substituting wage. So let's look at the other case. Here, for instance, we assume that the wage substitution is just 50%. Yeah? And that means that only 50% of this liability is directly stemming as a cash infusion from our employee, whereas the other 50, in that sense, is a discount that the firm gives on the employee's credit. Yeah? So the amount of the credit is 100, whereas the employee just paid in just 50. Yeah? And that, of course, means that the credit is way, way more expensive than under a wage substitution of 100%. Yeah? Because, of course, if we now take the IRR as the cost of the credit, this IRR is calculated, of course, including this 50% discount on our credit. Yeah? And that explains the differences in sources and in estimates from different sources. Yeah? Because the source that I've mentioned before, with more than 10% true costs of the pension reserves, is even assuming that the wage substitution is equal to 0, and that means that the firm is first paying out the credit for free for 100%, and thus our discount is 100% of the employee's credit. Yeah? And that, of course, makes it way more expensive for the firm. This assumption that the wage substitution is less than 100% is also having some inconvenient consequences for the calculation of these true costs, because it means that here, for instance, if we now want to distribute evenly our discount over the lifetime of the credit, that as this lifetime is different for these different slices and for these different strings, the true calculation of these costs is rather complicated. Yeah? So here in the first year, for instance, our discount has to be distributed evenly over a lifetime of 35 years service. Then next year, the discount has to be distributed over 34 years, then over 33 years and the like. So it's really, really expensive to calculate the true cost of these pension reserves if we assume that the wage substitution is less than 100%, which is, of course, the more realistic case. Yeah? By the way, nobody knows exactly what the true wage substitution is, because usually, at least in Germany, these wages are, in that sense, negotiated between the unions for a whole bunch of firms, and these firms partly give their employees additional pension payments, whereas others don't. And the wage that is settled in these negotiations is the same for both of them. Yeah? So it's rather tricky to come up with a good estimate for the wage substitution. This is the reason, combined with the fact that it's rather complicated to come up with a clear-cut estimates for this case, which where the wage substitution is less than 100%, that for any outside analysts, I would give a personal advice that you should close your eyes and wish that or assume that the wage substitution is equal to 100%, because then this is solving a lot of technical problems in the estimates, and that would yield the result that the cost of credit is equal to what you find in the firm's P&L. So thank you for today. See you next time.